The sun was beginning to set as the small restaurant filled with the usual evening rush. The father sat at his usual table by the window, a quiet corner where he could enjoy his meal in peace after a long day of work. He had gotten used to the routine, the simple comfort of it. His life had been a series of routines lately. Work, pick up his son from school, take care of things at home. It wasn't perfect, but it was his life. And for the most part, he was content. But every evening, as he sat in his usual spot, there was one thing that caught his attention. Every night around the same time, a little girl would wheel into the restaurant. She was always alone, her wheelchair gliding smoothly across the floor as she made her way to a table by the back. The father noticed her almost immediately when she first started coming to the restaurant. She was quiet, reserved, her eyes downcast as she wheeled herself in. She always seemed to be looking for something, maybe a plate of food, maybe a quiet place to rest. But the father couldn't help but feel there was more to her story than what met the eye. At first, he thought she was just another regular customer, a quiet child with a disability, nothing out of the ordinary. But over time, he began to notice a pattern. The girl never ordered food. Instead, she would wait, sitting alone at her table, her eyes scanning the room as if she were waiting for something. At first, the father dismissed it, assuming that maybe she was just someone who didn't have much to eat at home. But then he noticed something strange. Every night, without fail, the girl would ask for leftovers. It started small, just a simple request to the waiter. But as the days went by, it became clear to the father that this wasn't just a one-time occurrence. The little girl was always asking for the leftovers from the tables, the food that customers had left behind. She never asked for a full meal, only the scraps. The father couldn't understand it. He knew that food was expensive, and he had seen how the girl never seemed to eat anything other than the leftovers she was given. There was something about it that bothered him, but he couldn't quite place what it was. He found himself watching her more closely now. He noticed the way she would sit, her hands resting on the wheels of her chair, her eyes fixed on the plate of food in front of her. She never complained, never asked for more. She simply took what was given to her and ate it in silence. And every time she finished, she would quietly thank the waiter and leave. No conversation, no extra requests, just the same quiet routine every evening. It was hard for the father not to feel for her. He couldn't understand why someone so young would have to live like this, relying on leftovers to get by. She didn't seem like the type to ask for handouts, yet here she was every day quietly accepting whatever was offered to her. It didn't feel right. There had to be more to the story, something that he didn't know. Something that kept her coming back to the restaurant night after night, searching for food she didn't even ask for, just what was left behind. One evening, the father watched as the girl entered the restaurant again. She wheeled herself to her usual spot, a small table near the back, just far enough to be out of sight but close enough to catch the edge of the kitchen. He could see her glance at the full plates of food that customers left behind, a slight look of longing in her eyes. It was subtle, but the father saw it clearly. It wasn't just about the food, it was about something more. She wasn't just hungry for food. She was hungry for something else, something deeper, something she wasn't asking for. The father's curiosity grew. He found himself thinking about her more and more. Why was she always alone? Why didn't she have anyone with her? No family, no friends to sit with her. She wasn't just any child. There was something different about her, something that made him want to know more. Every time she came in, she would leave just as quietly as she arrived, never staying long, always leaving with nothing more than the leftovers. It was as though she didn't want to be seen, didn't want to draw attention to herself. But the father couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, something he had to understand. He decided one evening to do something he hadn't done in a long time. He stood up from his usual spot and walked over to the girl's table. She looked up at him in surprise, her face soft with uncertainty. "Hi," the father said gently, giving her a small smile.
"How are you doing today?"
The girl looked at him for a moment as if unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to being spoken to in such a casual way. She had learned to keep to herself, to remain quiet and unobtrusive. But the father's voice was kind, not demanding or impatient. And slowly she nodded. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've noticed you coming here every night," the father said, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to check in on you, see if you're doing okay. The girl hesitated before speaking again. "I'm fine," she repeated, her eyes quickly looking away. It was clear she wasn't used to anyone asking about her, and it made her uncomfortable. She seemed to shrink back into herself, as though trying to make herself invisible. The father sensed her discomfort and decided not to press her further. He stood for a moment in silence, unsure of what to say. But then he noticed something. On her table was a small, crumpled envelope. He couldn't help but wonder what it was. Without thinking, he reached out to touch it, picking it up gently. "What's this?" he asked softly. The girl's face reddened, and she quickly pulled the envelope away from him. "It's nothing," she murmured. But the father wasn't ready to let it go. "Are you sure? It looks important." She glanced up at him for the first time, her eyes betraying a flicker of something, a mix of fear and hope, something he couldn't quite place. "It's nothing," she repeated. The father nodded slowly, but he didn't let it go. Something about her behavior didn't add up. There was more to her than met the eye. Why was she hiding something? Why was she always so distant? "I just want to make sure you're all right," the father said, his tone soft and sincere. "If you ever need anything at all, you can talk to me. You don't have to keep everything to yourself." The girl didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. But after a long pause, she nodded quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her words fragile. As the father returned to his seat, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had only scratched the surface of the girl's life, but he knew one thing for sure. There was something more to her story. Something that needed to be uncovered. And he couldn't just sit back and watch her struggle alone. The next day, as he went about his usual routine, he couldn't shake the image of the little girl from his mind. The more he thought about her, the more he realized that he couldn't ignore her. He had to find out what was going on. She deserved more than just scraps and leftovers. She deserved a chance at something better. That evening, he found himself back at the restaurant waiting for the girl to arrive. As soon as she wheeled in, his heart sank. There she was again, just like every other night, sitting alone at her table, quietly accepting whatever leftovers were left for her. But this time, the father wasn't going to let her slip away unnoticed. This time, he was going to take action. He wasn't going to let her stay in the shadows any longer. He had to find out what had brought her to this point, and what he could do to help. He walked over to her table once again, ready to offer his help, and this time, he would not let her go until she shared her story with him. The following evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city streets, the father found himself once again sitting in his usual corner of the restaurant. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of the girl. It wasn't just the sight of her sitting alone, quietly accepting whatever scraps were left behind. It was something deeper. There was something about her, something that stirred something inside him. Her silence, her distance, it spoke volumes. He had been watching her for a while now, wondering what kind of life she led outside of these quiet moments in the restaurant. She didn't seem to fit the usual pattern of children he had seen before. Most kids came with their families, eager for a meal and conversation. But she always came alone, always asking for the leftovers that no one else wanted. It was clear that she wasn't asking for charity. She wasn't begging or demanding. It was as if she had learned to accept what little was given to her, no more, no less. As the minutes ticked by, he saw her enter the restaurant again. The familiar sound of her wheelchair wheels rolling across the floor caught his attention. She was alone, as usual, making her way to her spot by the back wall. He watched as she settled into her seat, her eyes scanning the room before they settled on the table in front of her. This time, the father couldn't let it go. He stood up from his table, walked over to where she was sitting, and gently cleared his throat to get her attention. She looked up, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had seen him before, but he knew that she wasn't used to being approached. "Hey," the father said, his voice warm but gentle. "How's everything going tonight?" The girl hesitated for a moment, her hands resting on the wheels of her chair. She didn't respond immediately, almost as if she were processing the question in her mind. Then, after a pause, she nodded slightly. "I'm okay," she said quietly, her voice soft, almost hesitant. He could tell that she wasn't one to open up easily. There was a wall around her, a barrier she had likely built over the years to protect herself from the world. And yet, he couldn't ignore the feeling that she needed someone to talk to. He could feel it in the air, the weight of her silence, the loneliness that surrounded her. "I've noticed you coming here a lot," the father continued, trying to keep the conversation light. "You always come in alone and you ask for leftovers. Why is that?" Her eyes flicked down to her hands, a slight flush creeping up her cheeks. She didn't respond right away, and for a moment the father thought she might pull away entirely, retreating into her quiet world. But after a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anyone else," she said. Her words simple, but filled with a sadness that tugged at his heart. The father's heart sank. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The girl wasn't just quietly asking for food. She was asking for more than that. She was asking for a connection, for someone to see her, to acknowledge her existence. He realized that the food she asked for wasn't just about filling her stomach. It was about filling a void that had likely been there for a long time. "I don't have anyone to share meals with," she continued, her eyes still downcast. "No family, no friends. Just me." The father's heart broke a little more at the pain in her voice. He could hear the weight of her loneliness, the depth of her isolation. It was clear that she had been living this way for some time, relying on whatever scraps she could find, just trying to survive. "I'm sorry," the father said, his voice softening. "That's not right. Everyone should have someone." She didn't respond to that, but her eyes met his briefly before she looked away again. It was as if she didn't believe him, as if she didn't think she was worthy of having someone in her life. And in a way it made sense. She had been conditioned to accept whatever little bit of kindness came her way, not expecting much more than the bare minimum. The idea of someone truly caring for her, of being there for her, must have felt like a foreign concept. The father sat down across from her, careful not to invade her space. He wanted to reach out, to offer her something more than just food, but he didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable. Instead, he simply sat there in silence for a moment, letting her process what had been said. "I'm not asking you to take care of me," the girl said quietly, breaking the silence. "I just need enough to get by. I don't want to be a burden to anyone." The father looked at her, his heart aching. He could see the pride in her eyes, the reluctance to ask for more than what she felt she deserved. She didn't want to be a burden to anyone, but she didn't realize that by accepting help, she wasn't taking anything away from anyone. She was simply allowing herself to be seen, to be valued. "You're not a burden," the father said firmly. "No one should have to live like this, and you don't have to do it alone." She looked up at him, her expression conflicted, as if she wanted to believe him but couldn't quite bring herself to. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. The father sighed, his gaze softening. "Because you deserve more than just leftovers," he said simply. "You deserve to have someone who cares about you, who wants to see you do well. You don't have to live this way." The girl remained silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then for the first time she smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a smile that spoke of hope, of the possibility of something better. And in that moment, the father knew that he couldn't just stand by and watch her continue living in the shadows. He had to help her, even if it was just in small ways at first. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. The father nodded, a sense of determination building inside him. "You don't have to thank me. You just have to know that you're not alone anymore. I'm here for you." And with those words, something shifted. The girl, who had spent so long living in the background, finally felt seen. It was just the beginning, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, she had someone who cared. Someone who wasn't just giving her leftovers. The father wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her slip away into the shadows again. The father had always been the kind of person who kept to himself. He didn't ask questions unless they were necessary, and he avoided getting too involved in other people's lives. But there was something about the little girl that made him want to learn more about her, something that tugged at his heart every time he saw her sitting there alone. It wasn't just her quiet presence that stood out, or the way she accepted everything with grace. It was the way she seemed so at peace despite the circumstances she was in. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, that there was something deeper behind her constant visits to the restaurant, always quietly accepting whatever scraps were left behind. It was that evening when he decided he could no longer sit in silence. He couldn't let her keep going on like this without offering her something more. And so when he saw her again a few days later, he decided to follow her after she left the restaurant, just to understand her better. He stood up from his usual spot at the back of the restaurant and, after a moment's hesitation, made his way outside. The street was busy, bustling with people going about their own routines, unaware of the quiet girl in the wheelchair who had just left the warmth of the restaurant. The father, determined but unsure of what he might find, followed her at a distance, careful not to make his presence known. She moved slowly, her wheelchair pushing along the uneven pavement with an almost mechanical rhythm. As he followed her down the street, he couldn't help but notice the way the girl seemed to navigate the world around her. She was skilled at maneuvering her wheelchair, but the path was not an easy one. There were potholes, cracks in the sidewalk, and uneven surfaces that made every movement a challenge. The father couldn't imagine how difficult it must be for her to get around. Yet she moved with a sense of purpose, as though she was used to the struggle. He kept a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude, but his heart ached as he watched her. The streets weren't kind to her. It wasn't just the physical challenges that seemed to weigh her down. It was the look in her eyes. He could see the weariness in her face, the quiet resignation that came from a life of hardship. She had learned, perhaps from a young age, to accept the world as it was, without expectation, without complaint. He followed her for several blocks, unsure of what he was expecting to find. Eventually, they reached a part of the city that was far from the bright lights and busy streets. The buildings here were older, rundown. Many of them were abandoned, their windows boarded up, their doors locked shut. The father felt a lump in his throat as he watched the girl navigate through this part of the city with the same determination she had shown on the main streets. She eventually stopped in front of a building that seemed even worse for wear than the others. It was an old apartment complex, its paint chipped and peeling, its windows cracked. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing that suggested it was home to anyone. Yet the girl seemed at ease here, as though this was where she belonged. She reached for the door with a practiced hand, pushing it open and entering the building. The father stood on the sidewalk, unsure of what to do next. He had followed her this far, and now he found himself standing in front of a place he couldn't even imagine her calling home. It was clear to him now that she didn't have a safe, warm place to stay like he did. He thought about his own life, how different it was. He had a roof over his head, food on the table, a job that paid the bills. His son had everything he needed. But here was this girl, alone in the world, struggling every day just to survive. The father's mind raced. He wanted to do something, anything, to help her, but he knew that simply offering her food wasn't enough. She needed more than just meals. She needed support, a chance at a better life. But what could he do? What could he possibly offer someone who had grown up in a world so different from his own? He didn't know the answer, but he couldn't just walk away. He had to find a way to make a difference. And so, after standing on the sidewalk for a few moments longer, he made up his mind. He would talk to her. He would find a way to offer her the help she needed, even if it was just a small step toward a better future. The next day, the father returned to the restaurant, hoping to see the girl again. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that if he could find the right words, maybe he could offer her the kind of help that would change her life. And so he sat at his usual table, waiting for her to arrive. When she finally wheeled into the restaurant later that evening, the father felt a surge of nervousness. He wasn't sure how to approach her, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. As she settled into her usual spot by the window, he stood up and walked over to her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice tentative. "I've been thinking about you, and I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to talk for a moment." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She seemed unsure at first, but then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. The father sat down across from her, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to speak from the heart. "I've been following you for the past few days," he began, trying to explain himself without sounding too intrusive. "I saw where you live, and it's not right. No one should have to live like that." The girl didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. She simply listened, her hands resting on the arms of her wheelchair. "I can't stand the thought of you being alone, struggling every day just to get by. the father continued. I know I can't change everything, but I want to help. I want to make sure you have the things you need. If you'll let me, I'll help you get the support you deserve. The girl's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or disbelief. She had probably never been offered anything like this before. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything right now, the father replied. I just want you to know that there's help, and you don't have to do this alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the weight of everything that had been left unsaid was finally being acknowledged. The girl's life had been a struggle, but now, for the first time, there was a chance for something better. Eventually, the girl nodded. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know what to say, but I think I'd like that. The father smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't going to be easy, and there was no quick fix. But with this small act of kindness, he had taken the first step toward changing a life, and he was determined to see it through. As they sat there together, the father knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the father found himself thinking about the girl more than ever. He had always been the type to focus on the basics, work, family, and keeping things running smoothly. But now he realized there was something deeper going on in his life. It wasn't just about him anymore. There was this girl who had silently asked for help, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something about it. He continued to visit the restaurant each evening, keeping his promise to himself. He would make sure to check in with the girl, making sure she was doing all right. Every day she appeared a little less guarded, a little more open, though she still held on to her quiet demeanor. He noticed her more now. Her eyes, her small movements, the way she seemed to want to avoid the spotlight yet always sat at the table, waiting for the leftovers to be brought to her. Every time he saw her, it tugged at his heart. One evening, the father arrived earlier than usual. The place was still fairly empty, just a few tables occupied. When the girl wheeled in, she immediately went to her usual spot. But tonight, the father decided to approach her even sooner. He didn't want to wait until she was once again lost in the corner of the restaurant. He knew she wasn't someone who easily let others in, but maybe if he tried again, this time it would be different. He walked over to her table, his footsteps soft as he approached. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for a split second before she quickly glanced down again. Her hands rested on the wheels of her chair, fidgeting with the rubber grips. Hey there, the father said, sitting down across from her with a warm smile. How's everything going today? The girl looked at him for a moment, then nodded slightly. I'm all right, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He could tell she was still hesitant. There was something about her, an unspoken barrier she had built over the years to protect herself. But the father had come to understand her better. He could sense she wasn't used to people truly asking about her well-being. For so long, it seemed like she had gone unnoticed by most of the world. I was thinking, the father said, leaning forward slightly. Maybe you'd like to try something new tonight. You don't always have to wait for the leftovers. You could order something fresh, something just for you. The girl's eyes widened a little, and she looked at him with uncertainty. But I don't need that much, she murmured. You don't have to be shy about it, the father reassured her, his voice soft. Everyone deserves something nice for themselves. I'd be happy to help you. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Her fingers continued to twist around the wheels of her chair as she thought about what he had said. The father could almost see the internal struggle in her eyes. She had lived her life accepting less, never asking for more than what was given. To ask for something beyond the bare minimum was a foreign concept to her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the girl spoke again. I don't want to be a burden, she said, her voice trembling a little. The father's heart ached at her words. You're not a burden, he said gently, his tone firm yet kind. No one is a burden when they ask for what they need. You deserve to have what makes you happy. Not just what you can scrape by with. She looked up at him, her eyes full of doubt. But I'm used to this, she whispered, her gaze shifting to the empty plate in front of her. I've been used to leftovers for so long. It's enough. The father shook his head. Enough doesn't always mean it's what you deserve, he said. You deserve more than just enough. There was silence between them for a while as the girl processed what he said. The words hung in the air, a challenge she wasn't sure how to accept. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke again, her voice quieter, but with a spark of hope in it. Okay, she said softly. I'll try. The father smiled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. That's all I ask, he said. Just try. You don't have to do it alone anymore. The waitress came over to their table, and the father turned to her with a small smile. Could we get a menu for her, please? The girl seemed almost reluctant to hold the menu, as if she didn't want to pick something for herself. But the father didn't push. He simply let her look through it at her own pace. After a moment, she hesitantly pointed to a dish she had always wanted to try but had never dared to order. The father placed the order, and the two of them sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The girl seemed a little more at ease now, her hands no longer fidgeting with the wheels of her chair. For the first time, she seemed to trust that she could ask for more. She could ask for something that was just hers. When the meal arrived, the girl hesitated for a moment before taking the first bite. The father watched her carefully, noticing how her face softened as she savored the food. It was clear she had been so used to eating scraps that she never really allowed herself to enjoy a meal. But now as she ate, there was something different about it. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the experience. It was about finally having a choice, a chance to sit down and enjoy a meal, without feeling ashamed or uncertain. The father waited for her to finish, giving her the space she needed, and when she set her fork down, she looked up at him with a small but genuine smile. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice full of gratitude. The father's heart swelled. You're welcome. I'm glad you liked it. They sat in silence for a few more moments, the weight of the evening settling between them. There was something comforting about the shared space, the quiet understanding that had passed between them. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the trust that was beginning to form. It was about the girl allowing herself to receive something, to accept help, and to realize that she wasn't alone. As the evening wore on, the father couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. He had made a small difference in the girl's life, but he knew that this was only the beginning. She had opened up just a little, let down a small part of her guard, and in doing so, she had taken a step toward a better future. For the first time in a long time, the father felt a sense of peace. He didn't know exactly what the future held for the girl or for himself, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop helping her. He wasn't going to let her slip back into the shadows. She deserved so much more than just leftovers. And as they left the restaurant that night, walking out into the cool evening air, the father couldn't help but feel hopeful. They were on a new path now, together. And whatever came next, they would face it as a team. Weeks passed, and each one felt like a new chapter in the girl's life. It was hard for her to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Every day she was met with a new sense of hope, a new possibility. It wasn't just the food or the comfort that made the difference. It was the feeling of being seen, of being noticed, of finally having someone who cared enough to make her life better. The father's quiet support, his unwavering belief in her, had given her something she had never known before. A chance. She had been going to the center every day, slowly adjusting to her new routines. At first, it felt strange, like she didn't belong there, like she was out of place among the other children who seemed to have so much more. But over time, she began to understand that it wasn't about what they had or didn't have. It was about the care they received, the opportunities they were given to grow, and the safety they found in that place. The girl started participating in the activities at the center, At first it was just small things, sitting in on therapy sessions, watching other kids do their exercises. But then one day she was asked to join a group of children for a painting class. She wasn't sure if she could do it. After all, she had never thought of herself as an artist. But when the instructor handed her a brush and a blank canvas, something shifted inside her. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to express herself. The first painting was nothing special, just a mess of colors and shapes. But to her it was everything. For the first time in a long time, she was able to focus on something other than the weight of her past. She was able to just be, to let her emotions flow onto the canvas without worrying about judgment or failure. The experience felt freeing, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. When the father came to pick her up that evening, he found her sitting in front of the painting, a smile on her face. "I made this," she said shyly, pointing to the colorful mess in front of her. "That's amazing," the father said, his heart swelling with pride. "You did that?" She nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "I never thought I could." "You just needed someone to believe in you," the father said gently. She didn't respond at first, but the look in her eyes said everything. For the first time, she was starting to believe in herself. As the weeks turned into months, the girl's transformation continued. She gained confidence in herself, her abilities, and the people around her. She wasn't the same quiet, withdrawn girl who had accepted scraps for dinner. She was becoming someone new, someone who was starting to take control of her own story. She still had a long way to go, but every step she took was a victory. The father was there for every milestone, whether big or small. He cheered her on when she succeeded and supported her when she struggled. They had developed a bond, a connection that went beyond just helping her. He had become a father figure to her in many ways, someone she could rely on, someone who would always have her back. And in turn, she had become someone he could be proud of, someone he cared about deeply. One evening, after another successful day at the center, the girl and the father sat down for their usual meal at the restaurant. It had become a ritual for them, a time to unwind and talk about their day. She had come to look forward to these moments where she could relax and be herself without worrying about anything else. That night, as they sat down, she looked at him with a serious expression on her face. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice soft but steady. "Of course," he replied, his heart skipping a beat. He knew this was important. "What happens now?" she asked. "What happens when I get better? When I don't need the center anymore? When I don't need you anymore?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to worry about that. It was true that she was becoming more independent, more capable of taking care of herself. But that didn't mean he would ever stop being there for her. He hadn't just offered her help. He had offered her his heart, and that was something he wasn't going to take back. "Well," he said slowly, "I think the most important thing is that you don't need anyone to complete you. You've got everything you need inside you already, but that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. Whether you're at the center or out in the world, you've got me in your corner." The girl looked down at her hands for a moment, then met his gaze. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she whispered. "I don't think I ever really had anyone who cared like you do." The father reached across the table and placed his hand gently on hers. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You're stronger than you know. I'm just glad I could be there when you needed someone." There was a long silence between them as the weight of their conversation settled in. Neither of them had expected this kind of relationship to form, but now that it had, it was undeniable. They were family, even if it wasn't in the traditional sense. They had built something together: trust, respect, and love. The girl leaned back in her chair and looked around the restaurant. It was the same place they always came to, but tonight it felt different. She was different. She was no longer the girl who had been ashamed to accept leftovers. She was a young woman with a future ahead of her, with the strength to face whatever came her way. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The father smiled, his heart full. "I never would have." That night, as they finished their meal and walked out of the restaurant together, it was clear to both of them that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The girl was no longer defined by her past or by the challenges she had faced. She was defined by her strength, her resilience, and the love she had found in the most unexpected of places. And the father, though he had come to help her, had found that in doing so, he had helped himself. He had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could have the biggest impact, and that the love he had given her had come back to him in ways he hadn't imagined. Together they were ready to face the future, whatever it might bring, and for the first time they both knew that they would never be alone again. As the days turned into weeks, the father found himself visiting the restaurant more and more often, not just to check on the girl, but because he had come to care about her in a way he hadn't anticipated. There was a bond between them now, something unspoken, but strong enough to make him feel responsible for her in ways that went beyond mere kindness. He had seen her begin to open up, to trust just a little more each day, and he couldn't ignore the hope that had begun to grow in her eyes. The girl, for her part, had started to change too. She no longer came in with the same quiet, withdrawn demeanor that had marked her earlier visits. There was still a part of her that clung to the shadows, but it was slowly being replaced by something new, a kind of tentative confidence. She wasn't just coming in for leftovers anymore. She had started to order meals for herself, without hesitation, and every time she did, the father could see the light in her eyes grow brighter. She had begun to talk to him more too. At first it was small things, her favorite foods, little details about her day. But as time passed, the conversations became deeper, more meaningful. She shared bits and pieces of her life, of the things she had lost and the dreams she still held on to, despite everything. It wasn't easy for her. Her trust had been hard-earned, but with each passing day she seemed to find it a little easier to let go of the past. One evening, the father arrived early again, as he had gotten used to doing. He was looking forward to seeing the girl as always. When he saw her rolling in, her wheelchair gliding smoothly across the floor, there was something different about her. She was wearing a bright red jacket, a small but significant change from the usual muted clothes she had worn before. She had even put on a little makeup, just a touch, but enough to show that she cared about how she looked. She smiled when she saw him, a full, genuine smile, not the tentative half-smiles she had given him in the past. It made his heart swell to see her this way. "Hey," she said, her voice bright and warm. "Hey yourself," the father replied, standing up from his table and walking over to her. "You look great tonight." She laughed softly, a sound he hadn't heard from her in a while. It was a sound full of life, and it made him feel like they were on the brink of something special. She had come so far, and he couldn't help but feel proud of her. "Thanks," she said, her smile still lingering. "I thought I'd try something different tonight." He nodded, his eyes softening. "I can tell. You're looking more like yourself every day." She glanced down at her chair, then back up at him. "I didn't know I had a self left to find," she said, her voice quieter now, but with a hint of confidence. "Well, you do," he said, his voice full of warmth. "And I'm glad I get to see it." They both sat down at the table, and the evening unfolded in the usual way, slowly, comfortably, with the two of them talking about everything and nothing. The father had long stopped worrying about making her feel awkward or out of place. The girl wasn't just a guest at the restaurant anymore. She was someone he had come to care for deeply, and he was grateful for every moment they spent together. But tonight was different. The father had something on his mind. As they talked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the time had come for him to ask the one question that had been lingering in his heart since the day they first met. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice tentative. "Sure," she replied, looking up at him, her expression open but curious. "I've been wondering." The father paused, choosing his words carefully. "What do you want out of life?" "I mean, really want? What's your dream?" The girl seemed taken aback by the question, her brow furrowing slightly. She hadn't expected him to ask her something so big, so personal, but she didn't shy away. She didn't look down at the table or change the subject. Instead, she sat back in her chair, her fingers gently resting on the arms of her wheelchair as she thought. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice thoughtful. "I used to have dreams. I think everyone does when they're younger. But after a while, I stopped believing I could have them. I don't know what's left for me now." The father leaned forward, his gaze never leaving her face. "You can have them back," he said, his words firm, filled with conviction. "I don't know what happened to you, but I know that you can have your dreams again. You don't have to stop just because things got hard." The girl met his gaze, her eyes soft but filled with something new. A flicker of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. You really think so? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I know so, the father replied. You've already come so far. You're stronger than you realize. There was a long pause, and then the girl's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She blinked them away quickly, but the father had seen them. It was the first time she had let herself be vulnerable in front of him, the first time she had allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. I've never had anyone tell me that, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not like that. The father smiled softly, reaching out to touch her hand gently. You have me now, and I'm not going anywhere. They sat there in silence for a moment, and the father felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew they still had a long way to go, but tonight felt like a turning point, a moment of realization for both of them. It was as if a new chapter had begun, one where they both could move forward together. Over time, the girl began to dream again, little by little. She didn't know exactly where life would take her, but she knew one thing: she didn't have to face it alone. And with the father's support, she found the strength to step out of the shadows and into the light. The father's life had changed, too. He had learned that sometimes the most unexpected connections could change everything. He had found in the girl a reminder that people needed more than just food or shelter. They needed care, understanding, and someone to believe in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. And so, their story continued, not just as two people meeting by chance in a restaurant, but as two souls who had found each other at just the right time. The future was uncertain, but together, they had everything they needed to face it.